Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of Decoding the Unknown. With me, your host, Simon. The script today, The Greenbrier Ghost, the woman who solved her own murder, ooh, spicy, is written by Danny. Thank you so much, Danny, the format of the show. I've never read it before. We're going to explore this Greenbrier ghost, probably not a ghost, together. Let's get into it. There is an intriguing gravestone to be found in South Chapel Methodist Cemetery in Meadow Bluff, Greenbrier County, West Virginia. West Virginia! Da-da-da-da. That's the only thing I know about West Virginia. It bears the name of Zona Heaster Shue, who apparently lived a short life between 1876 and 1897. That is short. That's sad. 21 years old. But another name appears in the quotation marks in the middle of the gravestone, the Greenbrier Ghost. Burying a ghost might seem like a bit of a pointless exercise, but the plot thickens if you wander around 5 miles away to the Sam Black Church exit of Interstate 64, where you'll find a large black and white historical marker which goes into a little more detail on the controversial death of Zona Shue. Zona Shue is a weird name. It sounds like a shoe shop in Spanish or something. The conclusion of the inscription makes a pretty wild claim. Quote, only known case in which testimony from a ghost helped convict a murderer. I feel like I've heard this story before. Isn't that... I think this probably came up in like a video I made as like one entry of like bizarre crimes being solved or something. Anyway, the jury may still be out on whether there's any truth to this claim, and it doesn't help matters that the story is usually misreported and embellished in more recent dives into the case, which we'll be doing none of today. No embellishment, no misreporting, just hitting on people's ideas. Nobody is trying to suggest that a ghost was invited to the witness stand to give testimony in a murder trial, as that would clearly be bonkers. But it could be said that the truth of this case is pretty bonkers anyway, without the need for spectral figures floating around a courtroom whilst wailing at the terrified jury. A young woman was brutally strangled to death in 1897 and yet was deemed to have died of perfectly natural causes, leaving the killer free to strike again. I don't know what those bruises around her neck are. Sounds like something that happens post-mortem after a completely natural death, Your Honor. Come on. Only 2 people really know for sure what happened that night, but one of them is now buried in the ground. However, as it wasn't really in the best interests of the murderer to reveal the whole truth, it seems that it was up to the victim to rise from the grave and spill the haunted beans. Let's just hope that ghosts are inherently trustworthy souls, otherwise this could get rather complicated. Oh, hello there, what's that? You just catch me? Wearing my beautiful Vessies? Resting on my desk? That's right, I wear Vessies all the time. In fact, generally in my office, I don't wear shoes. Because in the summer, it's hot, and in the winter, I have underfloor heating, so I generally just go around barefoot. But anytime I step outside, especially if it's raining, I'm wearing my Vessies. I'm going to take my feet off my desk now because it feels weird sitting like this. It's such a strange experience for me. These just arrived a couple of days ago. They are the Torrent sneaker. I did have to look that up because Vessi have all sorts of different... They've sent me so many shoes over the years and I absolutely love all of them. My wife gets annoyed because we have like a shoe cupboard. It's quite a large shoe cupboard, but I think we must be the only family in the world where the dude has more shoes than the women, because mine is just lined with Vessies, and every day I'll just be like, this one today, that one today, depending on the weather. I mean, it doesn't really matter. You could, like, even these, which don't look waterproof, they are fully waterproof thanks to a material called Dymatex, and that's not water resistant, waterproof. You can, like, dip it up to here in like a pond. I guess more realistically, a puddle. I'm not sure why pond came to mind. But look, Vessies are the absolute best. Also, this is surprisingly light. And also, I like the colours. I never thought green was a colour for me. But I love these. And they've also, it's just this little beautiful touch. Like, why is the inside so nice? Why is there this, like, vibrant blue colour in there? And I don't mean that in a negative way. It's just such a nice detail. It's just so nicely put together. Vessies are the best. I've absolutely mentioned none of the talking points that I'm supposed to. So hopefully Vessi will be happy with this. They will definitely be happy if you go and buy some Vessies. And you can get a 1-year warranty, worry-free 30-day returns, and 15% off your first fare at vessi.com/TCC. I've worn them for years. I couldn't be happier. You'll get them and then you'll get more. It's just perfect. That's it. Back to the video. The Charming Man. Before she became known as the Greenbrier ghost, the woman in question was known as Zona during the period she spent on this physical plane. She was actually born Elva Zona Hiester, but dropped the Elva very early on, and towards the very end of her life, she would become known as Zona Hiester Shu, following a brief marriage. Born into a family of Bible bashers. It's a long time since I've heard the phrase Bible basher. I don't know if that has crossed the pond to America. We say like Bible bashers, people who are just a bit too much into religion, who definitely didn't believe in such silly concepts as ghosts or people rising triumphantly from the dead. Well, apart from Jesus, obviously, but that was special. Zona was one of 5 children born to a farmer called Jacob and a homemaker called Mary Jane, a Hiester, who was of English descent. They all lived simple, peaceful, and quite possibly dull as ditchwater lives in what was then the tiny village of Livesey's Mill in Greenbrier County, just at the foot of Little Sewell Mountain. This was absolutely miles away from the nearest town, which must have been a proper pain in the arse during all those dire emergencies when you suddenly realise that you've run out of rolling papers and toilet duck. Toilet duck? Wait, is that thing for cleaning a toilet, like the bleach? Is there any urgency to, I understand the urgency of rolling papers, holy, I need a cigarette. But, toilet duck? It's like the urgency of, a slightly unclean toilet? That spooky gravestone in Meadow Bluff is weird in more ways than one, as it would seem that it's got Zona's year of birth wrong, possibly because the gravestone was planted sometimes later and plucked details from incomplete records. Well, doesn't seem like a possibly, that seems like it's probably what happens. Someone's like, no, that's due to ghosts. It's more likely that Zona was born 3 years earlier than the stone suggests, in 1873, which would make her around the age of 22 when she hooked up with an older man by the name of George Woolwich in 1895. Neither of the families approved of this relationship, possibly because of the age gap, and wedding bells were most definitely not ringing in the distance. Wait, we don't say how old he is. But some records suggest that Zona and George conceived a child out of wedlock, which would have been frowned upon back in the late 19th century, particularly by Zona's God-fearing family. Yep, they bashed those Bibles. However, the child doesn't appear in any subsequent historical record, suggesting that it may have died very shortly after birth, or was perhaps given a new name after being given up for adoption. Well, let's hope it's the latter, but because it was the 19th century, it was probably the former. The past was the worst. George fell out of the picture within the next year, and Zona was said to have fallen into a deep depression by 1896, until a new man stepped into her life to sweep Zona off her feet. A man who had said to be a bit of a drifter, and was nicknamed after a freshwater fish. The man's full name was Erasmus Stribling Shoe, although he usually liked to just be called Edward or Trout. Trout are not an attractive fish, he says. Well aware of all those extremely attractive fish. But a trout? Why would you want to be called Trout? The way the story is usually told is that Trout Shoe appeared from out of nowhere under a cloud of mystery which obscured a secret murky past. But whilst he may not have been known particularly well within the small community of Livesey's Mill, it seems he hadn't travelled as far as some would suggest. The son of a blacksmith appears to have been raised near Droop Mountain, which borders Greenbrier County, and he later moved around quite a bit, including a stint in the town of Falling Spring, which was only around 10 miles or so from Livesey's Mill. Bearing in mind that nicknames are often dished out to convey where exactly someone had come from, it's possible the Trout had arrived in Falling Spring from the direction of the nearby Trout Valley. Or maybe he just had a bit of a trouty face. Bloop, bloop, bloop. Life may have panned out differently for him if he had instead come from the direction of Booger Hole in Clay County. Yeah, Booger would also be an unfortunate name, but so's Trout. Trout had followed in the footsteps of his father by becoming a blacksmith, and it's believed that during his time at Falling Spring, he was working for a wealthy and highly influential guy called James Crookshanks, who owned several largely self-sufficient forges around the region. Crookshanks, I feel, is like the oldest person name ever. Are there many Crookshanks around these days? Crookshanks must have considered Trout to be a good worker, as when Trout made the move to Livesey's Mill, he walked straight into another job at the local blacksmith's shop. Erasmus Trout Shoe made something of an impression on his new community. He was described as strikingly handsome, very well built, and bursting with natural charisma. Well, forget everything I said, he doesn't look like a trout, does he? He's extremely handsome. And he certainly made something of an impression on young Zona Hiester, who immediately fell in love with the new blacksmith in town and forged a romantic relationship with him. Again, Zona's parents didn't approve of this budding relationship. Oh god, what now, you Bible bashers? Perhaps it was something to do with the age gap, which was even bigger this time, as Trout was in his mid-30s, well over a decade older than his new partner. Oh, chill. Let's just say he's 35, so that would put half his age at 17, and 17 and a half, and we'll add 7, so 25. How old was she? And bear in mind, that's how we do it today. I think in the past this is okay. A decade's difference, in the late 19th century? Is that big of a deal? Or perhaps Zona's mother, Mary Jane, had heard some of the gossip blowing in from other parts of the region that this Trout guy was a bit of a slippery customer who was not to be trusted. But Zona wasn't putting up with any of that nonsense. She essentially told her parents where they could shove their opinions and perhaps their Bibles, and married Erasmus Shue within the very same year at the Old Methodist Church. Shortly after the wedding, the new couple moved into a modest 2-story frame home just around the corner from the blacksmith shop. The property was once owned by Mr. William G. Livesey himself, the founding father of the mill, but was now owned by Trout's employer, James Cruikshank. And whilst Zona's parents were still quietly boiling over with barely concealed resentment, married life appeared to be doing both Zona and Trout Shue the world of good, for about 3 months. On the Saturday morning of January the 22nd, 1897, Trout Shue made a short detour on his way to the blacksmith shop. He knocked at the door of an old log house belonging to an African-American woman called Martha Jones, more commonly known in the neighborhood as Aunt Martha. It was quite usual for members of the community to knock on this door to ask if Aunt Martha's 11-year-old son Anderson was available to run errands. I'm hoping that young Anderson Jones was bang up for this and was perhaps getting paid in some way for the jobs he was doing, but this is not documented. Still, he probably had little else to do on a Saturday morning in that tiny village, as it would be another 88 years before Super Mario Bros. Was invented. I know 88 years is a really long time, but we're talking about like these people, run around at the end of the 19th century doing blacksmith. I mean, I know there's blacksmiths today, but like the village blacksmith. And they're living in a frame house. Do they have electricity? I don't know. But it's like 88 years later, Super Mario. On this occasion, Trout asked Auntie Martha if Anderson would be free to do a few things for his wife back at home and check if she needed anything picking up from the market. Zona had fallen ill at the beginning of January and had been receiving regular attention from the local physician and coroner, Dr. George W. Knapp. Nobody in the village knew what exactly had been wrong with Zona, but the word on the street was that Zona had been suffering from, quote, female trouble. Okie dokie. She was now feeling much better, but had still been advised to take it easy at home for a while. Trout explained to Aunt Martha that he'd just like Anderson to check in on his wife and fetch anything that she might need. Trout seemed particularly anxious as he had a busy day in store at the blacksmith's shop and he wouldn't be able to get away at lunchtime to check on Zona himself. Anderson was already out running errands that morning, including a few jobs for Dr. Knapp, but Aunt Martha assured Trout that the boy would pop over to see Zona as soon as he had a spare minute. It sounds as if Anderson Jones was really in demand that day, as an increasingly agitated Trout returned to Martha's house several times throughout the next morning to check if the boy had seen his wife yet. Dude, if you're popping over to their house, just instead of doing that many times, just go over yourself. It's a bit weird, it's a bit suspicious. I really hope now that Anderson was getting properly paid for pissing about on Saturday doing jobs for everybody else in the village, and it does seem a bit weird that Trout didn't just pop home himself instead of going back and forth to Aunt Martha's house every half an hour. Exactly, it is a bit weird. Eventually, Anderson found the time in his packed schedule to trot over to the house of Trout and Zona Shue, but what he found was a sight that would haunt him for the rest of his life. It's very suspicious. I think Trout wants him to go and discover the body. Somehow, for some reason. Dude, you shouldn't be pushing it so hard. It looks really suspicious. Even if you got nothing to do with it, it looks really suspicious. Anderson later revealed that he could sense something was wrong as soon as he arrived at the property. All the doors and windows were closed, and there was something in the air that he apparently didn't like one bit. After opening the door and walking into the home, Anderson was confronted by the sight of the dead body of Zona Heaster Shue, one arm resting across her chest, whilst her head was strangely tilted to one side. It's usually reported in recent takes on the tale that Anderson found the body at the bottom of the stairs, but this would surely indicate that Zona may have died after tumbling down the stairs, and nobody at the time ever suggested such a thing. And that's because she wasn't found at the bottom of the stairs at all. We know this from a later interview in 1910 that Anderson Jones gave to the New York Sunday America in his own words, quote, "Reaching the steps, I saw a trail of blood. That scared me, but I went to the door and knocked. No one answered. I tried it, and finding the door unlocked, walked into the kitchen. The trail of blood continued across the floor to the dining room. This door, too, was closed. Once more, I knocked, and getting no answer, walked in. I stumbled over Mrs. Shue's body. There, she was stretched out on the floor, looking right at me through wide-open eyes. She seemed to be laughing. I was frightened, but still able to reach down and shake her. She was stiff and cold." So where the hell did the falling down the stairs come from? It sounds like she's dragged herself around in some sort of frenzy, and there's blood. Not falling down the stairs. Anyway, let's continue. Anderson panicked at the sight and bolted from the house, running straight back home to tell Aunt Martha that Zona Shu probably wouldn't be needing much from the market today after all. Aunt Martha dashed straight over the house. When she came across the body, she ran out again to find Dr. Knapp, whilst it was left to Anderson to run to the blacksmith shop and break the news to Trout. Oh my god. Dude, he's just a kid. Dude, what the f***? That's not a kid's job. That is going to be mega traumatic. You are going to remember that forever. When Trout arrived at the house, he cradled Zona in his arms and let out a howl of anguish. Over an hour passed before Dr. Knapp was able to make it to the house. Another bit of common misreporting here is that by the time the doctor had arrived on the scene, Trout had single-handedly taken his dead wife upstairs, washed her, dressed her in a particularly high-necked dress, laid her out on the bed and placed a veil across her face. That would seem like an odd thing to do for a man who'd only just discovered that his wife had died. Yes, I agree. Apparently this didn't happen. But also, I think people do weird when they're in grief and shock and all of this, so I'll cut him some slack on that one, but I don't think it happens because Danny says it's misreporting. But it seems that Trout had not been alone all that time, as Aunt Martha was waiting with him in the house, so it seems more likely that she did all the heavy lifting with washing and dressing the body, whilst allowing Trout time to grieve. Where are the police? What was the situation with the police at the end of the 19th century? And the choice of a high-coloured garment may purely have been down to it being the only posh dress that Zona owned, rather than an attempt by anybody to cover up a suspiciously wonky neck. However, there's no denying that Trout's behaviour after Dr. Knapp arrived was downright peculiar. Dr. Knapp was obviously keen to examine the body and ascertain the cause of death, and this was all fine and dandy until his hands went anywhere near Zona's head, at which point Trout would become hysterical and start to push the doctor away. Bro, you are looking guilty as fuck right now. Dr. Knapp attempted to persevere for a while, but Trout was now protectively cradling the head and wouldn't let anybody else come anywhere near it. At this point, Dr. Knapp quite incredibly gave up on any attempted examination of the head, feeling that it would only agitate the grieving husband even further. I mean, what do you want him to do? He's like a doctor, he's not the police. He's not going to be like, you, step away, I need to examine this body. He'd be like, I mean, what am I supposed to do? I need the police. I need someone like the sheriff or whoever back in the day to be like, yo, what was his name? The main guy? Step the fuck away. I'm looking at Shu's body. At first, he concluded that Zona had died from that well-known killer of millions, known as everlasting faint, in which a dizzy woman randomly faints for no reason at all and then stays trapped within the faint for the rest of eternity. I mean, stays trapped within the faint? That's just death, or like a really long coma or vegetative state. But then, perhaps realizing that this sounded a bit silly, he later changed the cause of death to complications from pregnancy. This is almost as baffling in many ways, as nobody in the village had ever heard anything about Zona being pregnant. Maybe Dr. Knapp was just randomly plucking causes out of the air after deciding not to proceed with his earlier ideas of teacup tremors, corset curse, and overexposure to poetry. Or maybe he knew something about Zona and Trout that they had kept strictly confidential. Now, this is just pure speculation, but it could have been the case that Dr. Knapp's recent regular visits to Zona were related to a secret troubled pregnancy that may have resulted in a miscarriage weeks earlier, and that this would already have been on the doctor's mind before he even stepped foot in the house that afternoon. Okay, fair play. Yeah, there's no knowledge that she's pregnant, but if anyone's going to know, it's going to be her doctor. Of course, it's still ridiculous that a coroner would reach an official verdict without even examining the head, and it may have been a good idea to just boot the grieving husband out of the bedroom for a while so that Dr. Knapp could get on with his job. Absolutely. Where's the authorities to do this? But it is possible that there was at least some logic in the coroner's premature conclusions, and perhaps his original verdict of everlasting faint was just a temporary measure to avoid making a disclosure that Zona had been pregnant. Either way, it was deemed that there were no sinister elements involved in the death of Zona Hester Shu, and that she had died of perfectly natural causes. But Trout Shu's behaviour grew increasingly erratic during the wake and subsequent funeral. As friends and family members approached the open casket to pay their final respects, Trout fiercely guarded the head end of the casket and shooed away anyone who dared to get a bit too close. Dr. Knapp's just like, now's my shot, and he's reaching in there to find that wonky neck. And Trout's like, step away, Doc! He was constantly fussing and fidgeting over the head, propping it up with a pillow and a rolled-up white sheet, which he was frequently adjusting. It was also noted that it wrapped a scarf around the already high-necked collar, which didn't match the rest of the clothing, and in fact looked rather silly. But Trout grumpily insisted that it was her favourite scarf, and that it's what she would have wanted. Some witnessed that Zona's head did look slightly loose from a distance, but it was impossible to get a close inspection without the risk of Trout biting off their fingers. At the time, his uncharacteristic behavior was simply put down to how he was dealing, or perhaps not dealing, with the grieving process. Yeah, fine, it is weird, maybe that's all that's going on. Doesn't mean you need to be like, alright, step away from the body, we're having a look at her face and neck and head, because your behavior is mad suspicious, Trouty. As the funeral drew to a close on January the 4th, 1897, in what is now known as the Sewell Chapel Methodist Cemetery, almost everyone in Livesey's Mill felt that the veil had been drawn over this tragic story as the casket sank into the earth. But there's one person in the village who really wasn't going to let this die. Oh no, it's her, isn't it? It's Shuey! Meet his murder. Mary Jane Hester was convinced that her daughter had not died from natural causes and that she had perished at the hand of her new husband. Dun dun dun, it's always the husband! How exactly she had reached this conclusion is not entirely clear. Maybe she couldn't get over the fact that her daughter had married this drifter against her wishes, and she wanted to be proven right that her initial instincts about the man had always been bang on the money. As we suggested earlier, it could have been that she had dug up a few more details about the man's past from nearby towns, details which were not yet widely known about the new village blacksmith. Or perhaps it's more likely that her suspicions were triggered by Trout's peculiar behavior at the funeral, at which she was rudely pushed away from the act of saying goodbye to her daughter. And these suspicions may have further fueled what happened next with the rolled up white sheet that had been propping up her daughter's head. Mary Jane had somehow managed to get hold of this sheet before the casket was lowered into the ground. It must have been quite an accomplishment to grab this sheet without getting rugby tackled to the ground by the grieving husband, but Mary Jane must have been in a particularly determined mood. Her original intention was to hand the sheet back to Trout, but he didn't seem very impressed in taking it back when it was offered, and so Mary Jane kept it as a memento. It stank a bit, though. So she decided to give it a good wash in the tub, but was then surprised to see that the white sheet was bleeding out a red colour. Alright, as Mary Jane Hester put it, I washed my white clothes, and when I pressed it down in the tub it turned red, and I concluded I had spoiled my other clothes. But when I dipped up water in my hand, the water was not coloured. I washed it, and boiled it, and hung it out, and froze it 3 or 4 days, but it still had a reddish colour. Wait, it's not going to be blood. Blood turns like a brown colour, right? After some time. This might not necessarily have proven anything particularly useful. It's quite conceivable that the same rolled-up sheet could previously have been used by an innocent husband or Aunt Martha to mop up the trail of blood in the house left behind by a woman who died of natural causes. Why is there a trail of blood behind a woman who died of natural causes? I mean, I know there can be reasons, like maybe you got like a stomach ulceration or something and you're like throwing up blood, or you got some like problems going on downstairs in your like, butt. I don't know. Guess so, maybe. But I feel like that would have been mentioned. Like there was loads of blood over her face or her ass. But Mary Jane's nose was still very much twitching, even if nobody else in the village appeared to agree with her. Some of them may have just thought that Mary Jane always had it in for poor old Trout, a charming and likeable man who was now a widower. Even her own husband Jacob didn't appear to have much say in this regard, and may have felt that his wife was just lashing out in anger and laying flowers at the wrong plot. So, Mary Jane had to resort to what any good Christian would do. She prayed every night to God for the answers that would reveal what really happened to her daughter on that night. The ghosts. It's ghosts. And although it took a few weeks, I imagine that God is almost as busy as young Anderson Jones. She claims that God eventually heeded her call by sending down the ghost of Zona Shu to reveal the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Alright, surely no one believes you, because you've got it in for the husband. But do I think it's the husband? I mean, he's the most likely suspect so far, and his behavior is incredibly weird, but also you're extremely biased. Actually try looking for some real evidence. Much like Ebenezer Scrooge, Mary Jane received a total of 4 ghostly visitations. Wait, didn't Scrooge ghost of Christmas past, present, and future? 4 visitations? Oh, it's been a while since I read Scrooge, A Christmas Carol, but I thought it was 3. Was there a 4th? What is the 4th? But unlike Scrooge's tight schedule on the night of Christmas Eve, Mary's visitations were staggered across 4 consecutive nights, and they were all of the same ghost. Well, at first it was just a bright light that flooded the whole of Mary Jane's bedroom in the middle of the night. I assume that husband Jacob either slept in a separate bedroom or was a very heavy sleeper. Oh my god, I'm out like a rock. And I'll wake up, if I wake up in the night, I often just won't remember. I'll go to pee in the night, and my wife will be like, say something to me. And she'll be like, oh yeah, when you peed in the night, you said this. I'll be like, I don't remember. no memory of that. And she's like, oh no, I came to bed after you last night. And you woke up and said goodnight. It's like, I don't even remember you coming to bed. I am out. And I'm out until my alarm aggressively wakes me up at 5 o'clock. The bright light eventually settled into the shape of a spectral Zona who informed her that she would return the following night with the story of how she really met her fate, and it makes you wonder if there was much point to this original visitation, as it seemed largely just a trailer for tomorrow night's entertainment, but still, what a cliffhanger. The story unfolded over the course of the next 2 nights as the ghost returned as promised with all the incriminating details. The ghost claimed that Erasmus Trout Shoe had been an abusive husband over the course of their brief 3-month marriage, and had regularly beaten her. Yeah, but it's just a ghost saying this. There's no evidence. But things reached a head one night when Trout returned home from work to find that his wife had prepared a supper of bread and butter, applesauce, and raspberry jelly. I'll be honest, I'll be a bit disappointed with that. Yeah, bread and butter, applesauce, and raspberry jelly. I'll be like, what the fuck is this, breakfast? Where's my dinner? Why is there no meat? I wouldn't say that because it's extremely rude, but I would be like, is this what I'm having for dinner? It's an interesting choice, my dear wife. Like, I do most of the cooking in my house, so it would be me making this weird dinner and her being like, where's the meat? Whistle. I think I would have been tempted to politely decline the offering before nipping out to grab myself a couple of microwavable pizza pockets. Trout's beef with supper was that it didn't contain any meat. Bang on, mate. And I have to assume that the shops were already shut, as he took great exception to the bread and butter, applesauce, and raspberry jelly. According to the ghost of Zona Shoe, he flew into an uncontrollable rage, launched himself at his wife, seized each side of her head, and dislocated her neck with a sudden wrench, after which Zona dropped lifeless to the floor. Well, which seems like a completely reasonable reaction. I mean, meat's very important. It's how we get our manly protein. I make a joke, but I really do feel a meal is incomplete if it doesn't have meat. My wife the other day was like, how about we just have some ratatouille? Roasted vegetables and tomato sauce. And I'm like, and? I mean, that's a nice side. But what will we be eating? The next morning, he called in to see Aunt Martha so that her boy would be the first to discover the body, whilst Trout was busy in the blacksmith shop, presumably hoping that everyone would assume that Zona had died of natural causes at some point in the day whilst he was out grafting at work. During the second and third nightly visits from the ghost of Zona, she apparently described the 2-story frame house in great detail, and Mary Jane was later able to accurately relay this information to others, even though she claimed to have never visited the property. Or, more realistic, she did visit the fucking property. It was her daughter's house. As much as she doesn't like the husband, I'm betting she's been there. And maybe Zona was the only one who knew about it, but guess what? Zona's dead. Or, I mean, she's a ghost. Whatever. Zona also asked her mother to retrieve something of importance which could be found in a hollow located behind a plank in the cellar around the back of Aunt Martha's log house. I am getting the feeling that her mum killed her. And that's obviously way less likely than the husband. But I don't know. This is weird. Like, oh no, I know where the ghost told me where the murder weapon is. And it's like, the ghost did, huh? Huh? Really? The ghost did? The ghost told you where it was hidden? On her final visit, the ghost did very little, except prove that her neck had gone quite wobbly by dramatically rotating her head 180 degrees before departing the bedroom, after which she was never seen again. Dun dun dun! It seems a bit offbeat that Zona would make a special extra visit just to pull off a sinister party trick, but perhaps she was getting a bit of revenge on her mother for acting like such an interfering pain in the arse over the last few years. She'll be like, look, my head twists round. One more thing. Stop with your fucking Bible bashing, mum. It makes me sick. I still maintain that all 4 visits could have easily be squashed into one, and that there was no need to spin it out into a long-running serial bookended by a teaser and a post-credits twist. Literally. But now Mary Jane was more convinced than ever that her prayers had been answered, and that her suspicions had been right all along. Word soon got around that Mary Jane had been visited by her dead daughter, and whilst some of the locals scoffed at the very thought, there were others who began to feel genuinely spooked about the whole thing, and wondered if there could be something in the allegation that Trout Shoe was a murderer. Some of the village folk even claimed to have seen or felt the presence of the ghost now looming large over Livesey's mill, and began reporting unusual disturbances around the property at which she was found dead. Jacob still didn't seem too taken with the idea, and it sounds as Jacob's the husband, right? As if he wanted no involvement. It's like, fucking MJ. Mary Jane, stop it! Have you been smoking the Mary Jane again? Because this is some utter nonsense. But Mary Jane did manage to convince her brother-in-law, Johnson Hester, that the matter needed further investigation. I mean, yes, I believe the matter needs further investigation. Like, The doctor should have had a poke around the old neck, but not because of what the fucking ghost says. Is Mary Jane doing the right thing for the wrong reasons? And so Mary Jane and Johnson popped along to see the local prosecuting attorney, John Preston, to try and convince him that the case of Zona Shoe needed to be reopened immediately in light of the compelling fresh evidence presented by ghostly spirits. Oh, I made a dumb mistake. I was like, I think it's the mum. Why would the mum be trying to reopen the case? The case is closed and the daughter is buried. There's no reason for that. Everyone at home was probably like, Simon, what's the motivation here? Why would you be doing that? And it's like, okay, I get it. I get it. My brain is tiny. I'll get there eventually, okay? Just slowly. At first, Preston probably wished that he hadn't bothered opening his door to this pair of clowns, and he was probably already aware of the ghostly gossip and rumours that had been slowly spreading throughout the village. But after several hours of heavy pestering, an initially hesitant Preston eventually agreed to ask a few questions around town, although we don't know for sure if he thought there might be some truth in the allegations, or if he just wanted to get Mary Jane and Johnson out of his office. His first port of call the next day was a visit to Dr. George Knapp, and Preston was staggered to find out that the coroner had not bothered to carry out a full examination because the husband had gone into a wild frenzy every time Dr. Knapp attempted to approach his head. I mean, they're just finding this out now? What's going on? Why aren't the police like, yo, take a look at the neck? Why can't he look at the fucking neck? I don't understand. I know it's the past, but people get together. Preston also dispatched a few deputies to talk with neighbours, friends, and everyone who attended the funeral, and again became increasingly concerned when the same story kept bouncing back of Trout Shoe ferociously guarding the casket and refusing to let anyone come anywhere near it. Okay, I'm back to thinking old Trouty was the killer. It's so weird. His behaviour's so weird. Or even if it was an accidental death and he knows about it. Something like that. There's definitely something going on here. I mean, obviously a woman's dead. John Preston was beginning to smell something fishy about Trout, particularly as his erratic behaviour always seemed to be centred around hiding his late wife's neck, which the ghost of Zona Shoe had claimed was dislocated with fatal force. Wasting no time, Preston agreed to take on the case and managed to obtain a warrant for the exhumation of Zona's body. Excellent! So that Dr. Knapp and two of his associates might be able to conduct a proper autopsy without tripping over the husband. Yeah, but why do we have to bury her before we did this? Come on! Having said that, Trout was invited to the autopsy and inquest. He's like running in there, guarding that fucking neck. Although, strangely enough, he didn't seem mad keen on the idea of accepting the invite. He didn't have much choice, though. Preston informed him that his presence was mandatory and that a court order would be obtained to force him to attend if he didn't go of his own accord. Yeah, I don't know. This kind of stuff. I'm like, yeah, we're definitely going to get the court order. Okay, go ahead. And if you do, then I will come. Like, police and stuff would always say this, but it's harder than they say. It seems a bit harsh to me to drag along a potentially innocent man to the autopsy of his recently deceased wife and make him watch, yeah. And I think that his lawyer would be like, yo, judgy, how about no? And the judge would be like, yeah, you sick fucks. Just tell him what you found. Why does he need to watch? But Prosecutor Preston clearly wanted him there, even if this time it would be the husband getting shoved away from the body if he got too close. Again, who gives a shit what Prosecutor Preston wants? Prosecutor Preston is the prosecutor. Get a lawyer. What was his name? Trout. I'm terrible with names. A group of neighbours were roped in to dig up the grave, and while some of them initially refused to do so, possibly because of superstitious feelings about disturbing the dead, Preston got tough again and told them that they would be arrested if they didn't start getting busy with the spades. Preston, I think you're overstepping. He'd be like, no, you got to dig this hole. You can imagine just living in a village and the prosecutor comes along and is like, yo, Simon, you got to go dig up this grave. And be like, dude, I'm busy. I'm at work today. He'd be like, I'm going to arrest you if you don't. On what fucking grounds, Preston? You're not even an officer. You're a prosecutor. You're a lawyer. You can't arrest me. Get the fuck out of here, you douchebag. The body of Zona Shoe was then taken to a nearby schoolhouse, at which Dr. Knapp and his two associates began to undertake a thorough examination that lasted for 3 hours in the presence of John Preston and Trout Shoe. The young boy, Anderson Jones, also claimed to witness the autopsy, although, again, it's a little odd that an 11-year-old boy would be invited to watch something as macabre as this. In that later 1910 interview, Anderson claimed that Trout was becoming increasingly agitated and fidgety as he sat on his chair with a knife in his hand, whittling on a stick. He recalled, quote, Dr. Knapp was working around Mrs. Shoe's head. I could see Shoe was getting more nervous. His whittling was not so good. This is the most historic thing ever. What was he doing? He's out there. He's like, how I imagine people in the past, out on a deck, a wooden deck, in a weird hat, whittling a stick while drinking beer, like from one of those old cups. I mean, this is American past. In UK past, they'd be having tea. I'm probably not sitting on it. I'd be inside because it's fucking cold. If I'd have been present at the autopsy, and why not, everybody else got an invite, I think I would have felt more nervous about the chief suspect being allowed to play with a knife. The Pocahontas Times published the findings of the autopsy the following day. The newspaper revealed the discovery was made that the neck was broken and the windpipe smashed. On the throat were the marks of fingers indicating that she had been choked. Sounds completely natural to me. The neck was dislocated between the first and second vertebrae. I mean, that occurs all the time naturally in young people. Or not, this doesn't even happen to anyone. Your vertebrae don't just like... The ligaments were torn and ruptured. The windpipe had been crushed at a point in the front of the neck. Bruh, that's murder. Someone was fucking murdered. I mean, she was murdered. Someone did it. I think it's Trout. Shortly after this conclusion was reached in the schoolhouse, Trout was immediately arrested on suspicion of the murder of Zona Shu and escorted to jail to await trial. Yeah, as he should be. Quite bizarrely, on the way to the jail in the city of Louisburg, everyone reportedly stopped by at Trout's house, where the suspect cooked breakfast for everyone before they cheerfully resumed their journey. Alright, that's a bit odd. It was a different time back then. If Trout was capable of whipping up some half-decent grub himself, you wonder why he didn't just do this about a month earlier instead of murdering his fucking wife. Unless, of course, he was just serving up leftover bread and butter, applesauce, and raspberry jelly. Well, I mean, it's breakfast. Like, that's just toast and jam. It's perfect. That's great. We call jelly jam in the UK. Still, he resisted what must have been a strong temptation to poison his captors and make a run for it. I mean, how's he going to poison them? Does he just naturally have poison in his house? He's just mixing him with fucking eggs? Instead, he found himself languishing in jail for around 4 months, during which time there were conflicting reports about his behavior and attitude. It's often said that he got all cocky and arrogant, declaring that they will not be able to prove I did it. But there doesn't appear to be any strong evidence for this, and it's perhaps more likely that the Pocahontas Times painted a more realistic picture when they briefly reported Trout Shu, now in jail awaiting trial for murder of his wife, has threatened to kill himself. However, if Trout had indeed developed a bit of a swagger during his time in jail, then you arguably couldn't blame him, as John Preston, still the prosecutor, didn't have an awful lot with which to assemble his case aside from the words of a ghost. But the prosecutor had come up with a couple of interesting little nuggets after he had poking around the murky history of Trout Shu. For starters, he had previously served time in prison for stealing a horse, and it turns out that this wasn't the first time he'd been married, or even the second, and it wasn't the first time he'd been made a widower. Dun dun dun! That's a nice cliffhanger, I like it. Mute witness. Trout was first married to Ali Cutlip, with whom he had a daughter named Gerta. The family lived together in Falling Spring, but it was far from a happy time for Ali, as she claimed that Trout was abusive and violent throughout the 4-year marriage. Uh-oh, Trouty, it's not looking good for you. Also, you stole a horse? Didn't they fucking kill people stealing horses back in the day? Horse rustling? No, it's cattle rustling. Stealing cattle. I think there was something special about horses that made it a capital offense. Not that horses are magical or anything, just that they were really useful for people. Trout later denied these unproven allegations and tried to make out that Ali was mentally unbalanced, but it was said that at one point a group of local men made an intervention by barging into the house of Falling Springs, dragging Trout from his bed, and throwing Trout into the frozen Greenbrier River. I like that. Mob justice. More sensational takes on this whole story put forward the idea that Ali was murdered by Trout, or that she died under mysterious circumstances, but Ali was still active and well and happily divorced when John Preston was snooping around for clues. You can't say the same about Trout's second wife, though, who died after only 8 months of marriage. It's often incorrectly reported that Lucy Trift was only 16 years old when she married Trout near Droop Mountain, and it was widely believed that Trout had in some way been responsible for her death, but had managed to get away with it. Look, if your first wife says that you abuse her, your second wife dies under mysterious circumstances, I'm assuming, and the same for your third wife, something's up, dude. I don't care if you're found innocent of all three, I would not be marrying you. All right? No matter how handsome you might be, Mr. Trout. No matter how charismatic. The most commonly shared account is that Trout had been attending to some masonry work on a chimney when he accidentally or intentionally dropped a brick on his wife's head, and she was killed instantly. Other accounts claim that she was poisoned. Past, can we get our shit together? These are two completely different accounts. It's certainly true that Lucy died on February the 11th, 1895, after just 8 months of marriage, but a dive through the 1880 census revealed that she was a decade older than is usually claimed, and it does seem a bit unlikely that anyone would be attempting to do masonry work during a freezing cold winter at Droop Mountain. It depends on how urgent the masonry work is, no? The fact is that a cause of death is unknown. Maybe Trout did have something to do with what could be described as a mysterious death, but it seems a bit unfair to cast aspersions when a 26-year-old woman living in 1895 could have died from any number of natural causes. Despite this, even some of the newspapers of the time wrongly stated as fact that Trout had killed all 3 of his wives. And whilst it's frequently implied that prosecutor Preston had dug up all kinds of incriminating secrets from Trout's unsavory past that clearly marked him out as a blindingly obvious suspect in a murder case, there's so many reasons why he's a blindingly obvious suspect. The fucking guarding of the neck, which turned out to be ruined. But I think, we should be careful not to get too carried away here. I'm fine getting carried away. This guy fucking killed her. Allegedly. I mean, he's been dead for a long time. Don't need to say that. He uncovered the naturally troubling allegations of Trout abusing his first wife, which never went to court and which he had always denied, and he learned that his second wife had died with no subsequent allegations of foul play. He also discovered that Trout once stole a horse, but that hardly puts him in the same barbaric league as murderer. I don't know, the people in the past were really harsh on the horse theft. I feel like it does put him in the same league as murderer back in the day. By the time the trial got underway on June the 22nd, 1897, John Preston still didn't have much in the way of hard evidence, and perhaps there's no great surprise there. If Trout had strangled Zona to death while they were alone at home, as Preston believed, there would be no witnesses. And taking into account the rudimentary state of forensic science in 1897, there wouldn't be much physical evidence to uncover that would be of any great value. Some of you now might be thinking, well, hold your stolen horses for a moment. What happened to that thing in the cellar? Oh, right, the whatever the ghost had told the mum. The ghost of Zona had apparently told her mother during one of her visitations that something of great importance was hidden in a hollow behind a plank in the cellar around the back of Aunt Martha's house. So, what could it have been? Well, unfortunately, that turned out to be a complete dead end. There was indeed a hollow located behind a plank in the cellar, but although a diligent search of the entire cellar was later conducted, nothing of interest was ever found. And it's hard to imagine what kind of evidence could have been in there anyway. It was hardly going to be a murder weapon if Trout had strangled his wife to death with his bare hands. Perhaps the ghost was hoping that Mary Jane would find a private notebook emblazoned with scribbled words on the cover which read, "Murders, What I Have Done" by Erasmus Trout Shue, Volume 7. Yeah, I don't have any. There were notebooks. This isn't even for this channel. What am I talking about? We have notebooks that say "Definitely Not My Crimes" for Casual Criminalist, and they are sold out. I need to sort some out. Apologies. Coming soon. Maybe they came already. Who knows? This episode probably won't air for a few weeks. Mary Jane later claimed that she had taken a look at the hollow herself shortly after Zona's visit and found that it was drenched in bloodstains. But it's a little baffling that all the stains had disappeared by the time the others took a look. And if Trout murdered his wife at home, it's not very clear why there would be bloodstains in a hollow round the back of someone else's house. It's what happens when ghosts tell the story. It's just made up. With a troubling lack of anything but purely circumstantial evidence, John Preston may have been expected to rely heavily on the testimony of the ghost, as the prosecution didn't really have much else to go on. So you got nothing to go on. Look, I think Trout did it. But is there enough evidence to convict him? Absolutely not. The ghost could effectively have become the star witness even if it couldn't make an actual appearance in court, and Mary Jane would have to recount the testimony from memory. That's not really how it panned out, as the 8-day trial got underway at a courthouse in Lewisburg on June the 22nd, 1897. In fact, John Preston and the prosecution team had made a strategic decision not to mention the ghost thing at all in court. Well, that's very sensible of you, Mr. Preston. It's been suggested that this was to avoid the risk of Mary Jane coming across as a raving lunatic in court. She was a key witness to Trout's strange behavior in the aftermath of his wife's death, and it might not have been helpful if she appeared to be a delirious nutter who believed she could talk to ghosts. Well, the defense is definitely going to ask her questions when she's on the stand about the whole ghost thing. Like, if prosecution's not going to do it, defense is. Wait, did the defense know about the whole ghost thing? I feel like they must, right? But there was a more logical and technical reason why Preston didn't want to fall down this unearthly rabbit hole. As the ghost wouldn't be appearing in court herself, anything relayed to the jury by Mary Jane would be dismissed as hearsay, of course. Trout's defense team was led by Dr. William Rucker and James Gardner, and they had no such qualms about badgering Mary for more information on the ghost, though. Yes, exactly. Prosecution, you've got to head this off at the pass. You can't just not ask the questions. The defense is going to do that, like I said. The common narrative implies that this was an attempt by the defense to discredit the witness in exactly the same way that Preston was trying to avoid. Of course. And this strategy spectacularly backfired. Oh, Okay, when Mary Jane managed to convince the jury that the ghost of Zona Shu really did return from the grave to reveal the truth about her murder, I can imagine being the defense attorney on this and being like, yeah, okay, we got to do the ghost thing because we'll completely discredit her. And then he like, what the jury? It's a fucking ghost! But let's slow down here for a minute. Firstly, the defense team may have felt that they had no choice but to bring up the ghost. Everyone in the courtroom, and probably everyone in the county, had already heard about the Greenbrier ghost, and the supposed visitations were at the root of the whole case. It would have been rude not to address the events that had ultimately led to Trout's arrest, and of course, it may have presented an opportunity to try and trip up the witness as she took to the stand with her fabricated ghost stories. But Mary Jane gave a calm and measured account of her nightly chats with her dead daughter and didn't budge an inch over the defense team's frequent suggestions that she might have been experiencing vivid dreams. Wow, jury, come on, use your brains. Really? Although the majority of transcripts of the trial have been lost to the windmills of time, the lengthy exchange between the defense counsel and Mary Jane exists in full, as it was published in a surviving edition of the Greenbrier Independent. The full transcript does go a bit back and forth, becomes repetitive very quickly, but here's a succinct taster of the cross-examination. Dr. Rucker, who is the defense attorney. Quote, was this not a dream founded upon your distressed condition of mind? Mary Jane, no sir, it was no dream, for I was wide awake as I ever was. Then, if not a dream, or dreams, what do you call it? I prayed to the Lord that she might come back and tell me what happened, and I prayed that she might come herself and tell on him. Now, Mrs. Hester, don't you know that these visions, as you term them or describe them, were nothing more or less than 4 dreams founded upon your distress? No, I don't know. The Lord sent her to me to tell it. I was the only friend that she knew she could tell and put any confidence in. Mrs. Hester, are you positively sure that these are not 4 dreams? Yes, sir. It was not a dream. I don't dream when I'm wide awake, to be sure, and I know I saw her right there with me. Are you not considerably superstitious? No, sir, I'm not. I never was that way before and am not now. Do you believe in the scriptures? Yes, sir, I have no reason not to believe it. And do you believe the scriptures contain the words of God and his Son? Yes, sir, I do. Don't you believe it? Now, I would like, if I could, to get you to say that these were 4 dreams and not 4 visions or appearances of your daughter in flesh and blood. I am not going to say that, for I'm not going to lie. Wow. And the jury were like, hey, okay, it's a ghost who came back and said it. Defense are just like, oh, for fuck's sake. Whilst it was said that Mary Jane's testimony throughout the trial generally went down well with the jury, Trout's performance flopped harder than a fish in a puddle. The Greenbrier Independent reported that his testimony, manner and so forth made an unfavourable impression on the spectators. Trout gave long, rambling speeches which often went into ridiculous detail on the most utterly irrelevant events. He often became aggressive, and whilst he admitted that he had served time in prison for stealing a horse, he angrily disputed pretty much everything else that was put to him. He claimed that vengeful spite was at the twisted heart of the prosecution's case, declared that everybody was out to get him, and rounded things off by daring the jury to look him in the face and tell him that he was guilty. You are not doing yourself any favours here, mate. It's like, I dare you, find me guilty, and they're like, guilty! Trout appeared to be an entirely isolated figure in the courtroom, and from what we can gather, not a single other person spoke up in his defense. In contrast, the prosecution wheeled out an extensive doctor, whatever your name was, the lawyer, the defense attorney, what you doing? No one? The defense? No one? Including his first wife, Ali, who repeated her claims that Trout had been an abusive and violent husband, Dr. George Knapp, who revealed the difficulty it had encountered in examining the victim's head, and a whole bunch of people who had attended the funeral and recalled how Trout had prevented anybody from getting too close to the high-collared neck of the body. Again, do I think he did it? Yes. Are we at beyond reasonable doubt yet? In my opinion, no. It's all circumstantial. That rolled-up white sheet which propped up the head in the casket and later leaked blood-red fluid in the wash was one of the very few pieces of physical evidence to be presented in court, but it didn't really lead to any meaningful result other than inspiring the jury to nod politely in agreement that the sheet did indeed look a bit pinkish. The prosecution wrapped up its case by painting Erasmus Trout Shue as a dangerously unpredictable man with a history of violence who was the only person known to be home with his wife when her neck was broken. The jury was reminded that Trout appeared to be in an increasingly agitated state when he was trying to get young Anderson Jones to visit the house and discover the body. Right, I forgot about that. Yeah, I do think he did it. and then went out of his way to sabotage the coroner's original examination. And during the period before it was officially known that Zona's neck had been broken, the prosecution pointed out that several witnesses at the funeral had observed the head of the body looking strangely loose before they were pushed back by Trout. Interesting that the prosecution was still making no reference whatsoever to a ghost in all of this. Yeah, I mean, the defense brought it up, and it was a winner. Lean into it, prosecution. Be like, yeah, I mean, and the ghost, right, jury? Right? And the jury's like, exactly, Prezzo, yes. The defense team argued that there was no way to prove how Zona Shu's neck had been broken and suggested that it could potentially have happened after her death from natural causes. For example, it could have become broken during the dressing of the body. Well, her neck was ruptured and the tendons torn, please. Or from jostling around in the coffin as Zona made her final journey across bumpy roads to the cemetery in a wagon. But I've driven on many bumpy roads. You know what's not happened to me? Fucking broken neck. Like, what the fuck? In conclusion, Dr. Rucker addressed the jury with the words, "There was no living witness to the crime charged against defendant Shu, and the state rests its case for conviction wholly upon circumstances connecting the accused with the murder charged. So the connection of the accused with the crime depends entirely upon the strength of the circumstantial evidence introduced by the state. There is no middle ground for you, the jury, to take. The verdict inevitably and logically must be for murder in the first degree or an acquittal." Oh no. It's like, why are you giving... Yeah, you can do murder first degree if you want. And Shu be like, bro, you're my lawyer. The fuck? After a wait of 1 hour and 10 minutes, the jury returned to the courtroom with their inevitable and logical verdict that Erasmus Shu was guilty of murder in the first degree. I agree, but I don't think we were beyond all reasonable doubt. I also think the defense attorney is a bit shit. It was sadly not recorded if the head juror was looking at Trout in the face when he was telling them that he was guilty. 10 of the 12 jurors had voted for the execution of Trout Shu, but as it was not unanimous, Circuit Judge J.M. McWhorter sentenced him instead to life imprisonment. This did not go down well with the local community, many of whom wanted to see Trout swing. A couple of days later, a large group of them formed a lynch mob armed with Winchesters and revolvers. They planned to storm the county jail where Trout was incarcerated, take him outside on the streets, and hang him themselves. Just before they reached the county jail, they ran into Sheriff Nickel, who had gotten wind of their plans and was chasing the gang on horseback. As the mob raised their guns at the sheriff, he raised his own and was ready to shoot them all down before he realized that he recognized some of their faces and decided instead to calm them down and talk them out of it. Even if the lynch mob had reached the county jail, they wouldn't have found Trout there, as he'd been moved to a secret location in the woods a mile or two outside of town. He was later escorted to West Virginia State Penitentiary to begin his life sentence. Now, the main question that I asked at the top of this video was whether Zona Shu's gravestone was entirely accurate when it claimed that her death was the only known case in which testimony from a ghost helped convict a murderer. I guess we knew the answer to this all along, didn't we? I forgot. Even if there were some truth in this statement, it would have nothing at all to do with the prosecution team, who would traditionally play the most significant part in securing a conviction for murder. They avoided any mention of it, and the ghost had no part to play in the murder case. But even so, there were people at the time who were convinced that the ghost played a key role in the jury reaching a guilty verdict. The son of a reporter who was present at the trial later told the Monroe Watchman in 1971 how his father had felt about the testimony of Mary Jane Hester. Those who witnessed the trial were very much impressed with her sincerity, and the jury of 12 good men of Greenbrier County and Judge J.W. McWhorter evidently believed her. The question of whether a person can return from the grave was very well answered. In the affirmative, like what? Meanwhile, the Baltimore American newspaper came to the following conclusion. The principal evidence was that of Shu's mother-in-law, who testified that her daughter's spirit had come to her and said Shu had killed her by breaking her neck. All the other evidence was purely circumstantial. We'll never really know how many members of the jury felt particularly swayed by Mary Jane's testimony. Judge McWhorter would usually have told the jury to disregard the whole story of the ghost as hearsay, but he may have found this challenging as the story was all over town, and so many locals appeared to believe it. I'd go for a change of venue. I'd be like, we need a change of venue, Your Honor. Saw too many ghosty people around here. But the ghost was never mentioned again throughout the course of the 8-week trial, and I would suspect that at least some members of the jury were making their judgment based entirely on the circumstantial evidence which was being presented to them by the prosecution. Whilst it's doubtful that any so-called testimony from a ghost really did help convict a murderer, as the gravestone suggests, it's still probably fair enough to suggest that Mary Jane's claims of visitation from a ghost prompted the reopening of a case which may otherwise have remained closed forever. And in that sense, a ghost helped convict a murderer. But there are still a few more troubling questions casting an eerie spectral shadow over this case. Was it entirely fair that Trout Shue was convicted of murder based on nothing more than circumstantial evidence? Is there a chance that Trout was entirely innocent? And did Mary Jane Hester genuinely believe that she had seen the ghost of her dead daughter, or was she playing a fiendishly crafty game and taking everyone for a fool? You have killed me. It's not the only time that a ghost or some form of supernatural occurrence has allegedly led to a conviction for murder. A long list of prisoners who served life sentences were apparently coaxed into confessing to their crimes by the ghosts of their victims, who stepped in to ensure that justice was served. One of the most famous examples was American serial killer Terry Childs, who was already serving life sentences for the murders of 3 children between 1979 and 1985. 30 years after he was first put behind bars, he suddenly decided to confess to the murder of 2 more children. Okay. Psycho. He claimed that he had been persuaded to confess by the ghosts of these 2 victims who were staring at him in his cell all day and night and eating up his brain. All right then. There were very probably other factors that prompted the confession, such as a desire for fresh attention in a life that was already doomed to end in prison. I suppose that Terry Childs could have been experiencing genuine guilt and remorse. I don't think someone who's killed 3 children experiences guilt or remorse. I think if you're I don't know anything about you, Terry, but, I don't think so. I think you're just a fucking psycho. But at one point he claimed to have killed 12 children in total, and neither guilt nor remorse compelled him to provide any details of the other 7 victims. There's another case that I just want to briefly mention, as it bears a few similarities to the Greenbrier ghost, and it concluded with speculation from some quarters that supposed supernatural forces helped the real killer evade justice. Alright, well, supernatural forces aren't real, so they didn't, but let's see where this goes. Known as the Red Barn Murder, this story from Suffolk in England took place in 1827. Jesus Christ, nearly 200 years ago. 24-year-old Maria Martin lived in the village of Polstead with her father, who was a mole catcher by trade. Alright then. Careers from the past are weird. What do you do? Catch moles. No one likes those. How do they stop those? You know, when a mole digs up your lawn, how do you stop that? Isn't there some sonic thing that they use nowadays? That makes a sound to keep the moles away? And her stepmother, Anne, who was only a year older than her stepdaughter. That's super weird. Whenever that happens, it's so weird. Maria Martin fell in love with a 22-year-old guy called William Corder, but it was a strange relationship as Corder kept insisting that they keep it a secret. Maria gave birth to their child in 1827 and was keen to get married to Corder, but her boyfriend was still acting all weird and didn't seem enthralled about the idea of making their relationship public. Oh, okay, sorry, Corder is her boyfriend. I was like, wait, she's got a boyfriend on the side? What is this, 2027, not 1827? The child sadly died shortly after birth, amidst rumours that it may not have died from natural causes. Eventually, William Corder agreed to the idea of marriage, but warned Maria that the authorities would be coming after her when it became known that she'd had a child out of wedlock. Wait, I thought that was just frowned upon. Was there a time when that was a crime? Wow. In the presence of stepmother Anne, he proposed that they meet in secret at a local landmark known as the Red Barn, after which they would elope together to Ipswich. Why would you choose to elope to Ipswich? I've been to Ipswich once. It wasn't very nice. Whilst both Maria and Corder entered the Red Barn, it would seem that only one of them came out alive. For a while, Maria's stepmother and mole-chasing father may have assumed that the couple had eloped to Ipswich as planned, but according to the letters they later received from Corder, they had in fact eventually moved to the Isle of Wight. Isle of Wight's weird, but if someone was like, do you want to live on the Isle of Wight or in Ipswich? I gotta say I'd choose the Isle of Wight. Isle of Wight's kind of nice. I got friends, good friends, who is from the Isle of Wight. He doesn't live there now, but he goes back there. His parents are from there. It's quite pleasant. It's a bit weird, but it's pleasant. But suspicions began to fester, as none of these letters came from Maria herself, and Corder kept offering increasingly flimsy explanations as to why his wife couldn't bring herself to put quill to paper. Why can't he just look at her handwriting and fake something? I know it's hard, and an expert's going to be like, oh, that's not quite right. But most people, they'd just be like, oh yeah, okay, sure. A few months passed before stepmother Anne apparently began experiencing troubling dreams in which the spirit of Maria explained that she had been murdered and that her body could be found at the Red Barn. Wait, they didn't know about the Red Barn, did they? Anne persuaded her initially skeptical husband to go and have a look, and he reluctantly agreed after he finished chasing moles for the day. It didn't take long for him to unearth a heavy sack with Maria's green handkerchief poking out at the top. Not daring to investigate any further, he rushed to alert the authorities, who later confirmed that the sack contained the remains of Maria Martin, with what appeared to be gunshot wounds to her body. Much like Trout Shoe, it was later discovered that William Corder had a bit of a criminal history, in this case selling his father's pigs without his father's knowledge, but his dad declined to prosecute. Well then, does he have a criminal history? I don't think he has a criminal history then. Should definitely say allegedly. What if old Corder here sues us? I'm just joking, it's 200 years in the past. Sounds like a dodgy When Corder was arrested on suspicion of murder, he was living with a new wife and initially denied ever having met Maria. Bro, you've had years to get your story straight, and that's what you're going for? You f***ing amateur. But he later changed his story and admitted that he had met up with her at the Red Barn. However, he claimed that he left the Red Barn after a quarrel and then heard a gunshot, which prompted him to return to find Maria's dead body lying on the floor with one of his own pistols placed next to her. Dude, you had years to come up with an excuse, and this is the best you could do? You're going to be swinging, bro. However, Maria's 10-year-old brother claimed in court that he had witnessed Corder walking into the Red Barn with a pistol and then leaving alone with a pickaxe. Fucking amateur, dude. This testimony appeared to convince the court of Corder's guilt, even if nobody could agree on a clear motive. It's always the boyfriend, it's always the husbands. That's motive enough. I say that. It's probably not most of the time motive enough, is it? It's like, why did you kill your wife, Simon? Well, she was my wife. Makes no sense. Sorry. I'm not very well. My brain's not working properly. I stopped recording this yesterday. And around lunchtime yesterday, and then in the afternoon, I was just like, oh, I'm getting sick. And today I am sick. And I'm in the office. Because I've got a lot to do, all right? But if my brain's a little slow, that's why. I apologize. It's speculated that Corder may have wanted to silence Maria, as she knew too much about his criminal past. Wait, his rustling of pigs. It's not that big of a deal, mate. Even if this largely boiled down to just selling his father's pigs. Or maybe he really, really didn't want to marry Maria. Look, I'm going to say that second one, even though it sounds weird, is more likely somehow. Or something else is going on. Entirely possible. William Corder was sentenced to death. I mean, like, despite the complete lack of evidence, I'm like, yeah, he's fucking guilty. Fucking hang him. He was sentenced to death and eventually confessed to the murder shortly before he was hanged in front of an audience said to be somewhere between 7 and 20,000. Well, there you go. He admitted to it, like when he knew he was cooked. Many of the locals were left convinced that it was the spirit of Maria who had helped the authorities find the killer via the medium of troubled dream. However, some historians have pondered over the possibility that Corder may have been entirely innocent. Well, he admitted to it. Was this under duress or something? Stepmother Anne had been well aware that Maria and Corder planned to meet in secret at the Red Barn. Oh! Okay, before the sudden disappearance, although it sounds as if Maria's father had never been made aware of this. So, these supposed troubled dreams were hardly providing an earth-shattering new clue that could have emerged from the spiritual realm, as Anne already knew that the Red Barn was the location of the last appointment that Maria was definitely known to have made. Why didn't you just come forward with that? I know it's 200 years ago, but aren't people still going to take you more seriously if you actually have this, bit of knowledge, rather than ghosts came to me in a dream? So why did it take a few months for Anne to suddenly decide that her dreams were pointing her in the direction of the Red Barn? One theory is that Anne herself was also involved in the relationship with William Corder. They were the same age, don't forget, and that Corder's reluctance to go public with Maria is because he was ultimately planning to run away with Anne instead. Anne may have been involved in the plot to dispose of the nuisance Maria, and may have even pulled the trigger herself, but then she was overcome with jealousy when Corder just buggered off and ended up marrying someone else entirely. Yeah, dude, what are you doing? Corder's the amateur here. Maria, Anne, whether she's guilty or not, doesn't really matter. The fact that Corder is does a crime with someone and then really upsets them is dude, no, you gotta keep that person sweet. What are you doing? Prompting a series of not-so-mysterious dreams from which Anne exacted her cruel revenge on Corder. I wouldn't say it's particularly cool. Cruel? I think he deserved it, to be honest. It's only a theory, of course, and maybe not entirely logical. Whilst a spurned Anne may have been fueled with a lust for vengeance, she must have known that she could easily have dropped herself in the noose by revealing the location of her own victim. Well, that's why she said it was ghosts then, I guess. Because she's like, how do you know? She's like, I didn't know it was ghosts. Kind of clever, to be honest, and I bet she gets away with everything. And whilst we may never be able to conclusively solve a problem like Maria, it does make you wonder if something equally suspicious was going on beneath the sifting dust of Livesey's Mill. I'm not suggesting that Mary Jane Hester and Trout Shoe were having an affair. I get the impression that the blacksmith Trout was way too rough for the god-bothering Mary Jane. She clearly despised him. But she was not being entirely honest, and by that I mean she was telling ginormous phantom porkies about being visited by a ghost in order to frame an innocent man. It's reported that prosecutor John Preston initially had 2 suspects in mind after he heard the results of the full autopsy. One of them was Trout Shue, and the other was Mary Jane Hester, as she was the only other person who appeared to have somehow gleaned knowledge of Zona Shue's real cause of death. It seems likely that Mary Jane was quickly dismissed as a suspect because her demands to reopen the case wouldn't have made any sense. There would have been no point in attempting to shift the blame onto Trout Shue because there was not yet any blame to shift at this point. Zona was wrongly deemed to have died from natural causes and the case was closed. Why would a killer lobby for reopening of a closed case in which they were the guilty party? Boom. That's exactly what I said earlier/yesterday, if I remember correctly. Again, my brain is foggy. And so that leaves Edward Trout Shue as the one and only suspect, unless you consider that young Anderson Jones might have done a lot more than just discover the body and had embarked upon a mission to wipe out the entire village so that he could enjoy a Saturday morning in peace for once. I know it's insane, but if you're the defense attorney, you could be like, yeah, maybe it was him. Maybe. Who knows? Reasonable doubt, baby. On the face of it, Trout's bizarre and suspicious behaviour after the murder does seem enough to get the word guilty echoing throughout Livesey's mill, but even so, the evidence was fairly weak and there was nothing that proved with absolute conviction that he murdered his wife. Relatives of Trout later pointed out that there was no motive whatsoever for a cheerful local blacksmith to randomly kill his wife just because he had been served bread and butter, applesauce and raspberry jelly. There is some speculation that there may instead have been a connection with a potential secret pregnancy. Perhaps Trout had only just discovered that his wife had either miscarried or terminated the pregnancy without his knowledge, and this prompted the fatal attack. But a clear motive was never presented in court other than the prosecution portraying Trout as an abusive husband capable of unpredictable violence and abuse. Others have pointed out that Trout had plenty of opportunity to do a runner before Zona's body was exhumed. He must surely have heard the ghostly rumours circling around the village and must have felt the fresh fingers of suspicion pointing squarely in his direction, yet chose to stay put, which may possibly have been an indication of his complete innocence. But the prosecution insisted that Trout was labouring cockily under the misapprehension that he couldn't be found guilty on purely circumstantial evidence. Bro, you can be found, if there's enough circumstantial evidence. It's a jury, dude. Jury's going to be like, yeah, no. It's not like, oh, it's just circumstantial, you can't be guilty. Jury's going to decide, dude, and they are putting you in the noose. Chair? Noose? Did they hang him? Besides, he may have found it unlikely that the case really would be reopened on the strength of a woman claiming she had seen a ghost. During the trial, Trout had angrily claimed in his defense that everyone was out to get him in this case, built on nothing but vengeful spite, and perhaps this was more than just paranoid ranting. Mary Jane clearly never liked him at all, and Trout's first wife, Allie Cutlip, may have had more than a reasonable axe to grind with her allegedly abusive and violent former husband. Sure, but she's got that axe to grind because he was abusive and violent, which definitely speaks to his character. Some have suggested the prosecutor Preston effectively brought together a coalition of witnesses who were desperate to see Trout's downfall, regardless of whether or not he was guilty of murder. But although the evidence may not have led to a guilty verdict today, it still felt by many that the jury reached a fairly reasonable conclusion based on the wealth of testimony that described his alleged abuse and his deeply suspicious and disruptive behavior around his wife's body. And it probably didn't help matters that he came across as a bit of a dick in court. But where does this leave the ghost? Now, some of the locals are convinced that the ghost was genuine simply because Mary Jane was able to describe the layout of a house that she claimed to have never seen. Yeah, but she just claims that. It was... she could have definitely been to the house, or it had been thoroughly described to her by someone. But I think we have to take that with a pinch of sulphur, as we can't be sure that Mary Jane had never seen the house in the whole time she lived in the tiny village of Livesey's Mill. Also, again, it could have been described to her. You'd also presume that the genuine ghost of Zona Shue would have got every detail exactly right about her own murder, but it didn't quite manage that. According to Mary Jane, the ghost recalled that Trout had seized each side of her head and dislocated her neck with a sudden wrench. The later autopsy revealed finger marks on her neck, which indicated that she had been strangled before her neck was broken. While some might say that the difference is negligible and the outcome was the same, well, yes, you might say that, but it still doesn't take away anything from the fact that it makes the ghost story less real. The ghost story wasn't entirely accurate about her exact cause of death, and that might suggest that Mary Jane never believed that she saw a ghost at all, but was instead guessing about the events that led up to her daughter's murder and guessing what a ghost of Zona might have said to her. Although Mary Jane is often portrayed as a slightly nutty woman who thought she could see ghosts, I don't believe that for a second. No, I think she's I think she's clever. An intriguing new detail was unearthed in 1999, sometime later, which might just shed a bit of heavenly light on what exactly inspired Mary Jane to start telling fibs. Well, she wanted to find out about who actually killed her daughter and get what's-his-face in prison or on the noose. The writer and amateur historian Katie Letcher-Lal was putting the finishing touches to a dramatised book based on the Greenbrier ghost when she dug up an edition of the Greenbrier Independent from 1897, which was one of the first to briefly mention the death of Zona Shue. The segment was only a couple of sentences long, but I imagine that Mary Jane may have kept the newspaper, or perhaps just that particular page, for a while at least. The interesting point is the other much bigger piece on the very same page, which went under the headline of a ghost story. It concerns the famous Australian legend known as Fisher's Ghost, in which a man named Frederick Fisher mysteriously disappeared in 1827, but that was then largely forgotten about for months. One day, a highly respectable local man called John Farley began spreading the news that he had witnessed the ghost of Frederick Fisher sitting on the rail of a bridge and pointing silently at a paddock near the creek. This caused such a furor that other locals also started believing that they could see Fisher's ghost sitting gloomily on the rail of the bridge until eventually the police were pressured into investigating. They found the body of Frederick Fisher near the paddock at which the ghost had been pointing, and a man called George Worrell was later hanged for the murder. Wow, this is extremely similar. It was believed by many that John Farley knew something about the murder of Fisher, but death threats had scared him off informing the authority, so instead he concocted the story of a ghost which would run rampant throughout the town until the police were compelled to investigate. Yeah, I think this is it's like plausible deniability, right? It's like, how did you discover this? Came to me in a dream. It's like, is it believable? Not really. Is it plausible deniability? Absolutely. It's like nowadays it'd be like, oh no, that guy's a dick, allegedly in Minecraft. Same thing. Now, as I say, it's very possible that Mary Jane would have kept hold of this page of the newspaper covering the death of her daughter and may have reread the brief segment several times. During this time, she may have been brewing suspicious and dark thoughts about how her daughter died, but may have felt helpless to act now that the case was closed. Could it be that her attention was often diverted to the bigger piece on the same page, which inspired her to try and pull a very similar trick in order to get the case reopened? Wow, that's so interesting that this writer found this newspaper and was like, wow, that's kind of interesting. Look at that. Same front page, huh? So 100 or something years ago, 150 years ago, she was sat there reading it and then glanced over. God, that's interesting. I like that. I find that interesting. Some have poo-pooed this idea by assuming that Mary Jane Hester wouldn't have been able to read, based largely on a contemporary article in the Independent Herald, which described the Hester family as poor, uneducated country people. But that's a pretty big assumption to make. Literacy rates were on the rise at the end of the 19th century, with only about 10% of the US population deemed to be illiterate. Wow, that's kind of impressive. I assumed it would be lower. Mary Jane claimed to be familiar with the scriptures, so I don't think we can read too much into any claims of illiteracy. I've only once come across an illiterate person, at least that I'm aware of. I was working in a shop as a kid. I think I've told this story before, and some woman comes in and she buys a birthday card, and she hands it to me, and I'm like, brilliant, here you go. And she's like, oh, could you write it out for me? Here's a pen. And I'm like, well, there's a table right over there. Just feel free to use it. I don't mind. Stick around. And she's like, no, I'd really like you to write it out. And I'm like, all right. And so I do. And she just dictates it to me. And she leaves. And I find this rather odd. So I go home and I'm like, family, what's up with this? And they're like, oh, she's probably illiterate. And I'm like, there are illiterate people? Like people who can't read and write? And they're like, yes, Simon, there are. You sheltered douche. My parents wouldn't say that to me, but they probably thought it. Maybe it was just a massive coincidence, but I suspect that Mary Jane took the bones of the Fisher ghost story and fleshed out her own version in a bid to generate public attention and convince the local prosecutor to take another look into her daughter's mysterious death. I don't think that Mary Jane was acting out of spite. I reckon she genuinely believed that Trout had murdered Zona, so she put together her best guesses over the real cause of death from facts, allegations, rumours, and from how Trout was fiercely protecting the body's strangely tilted head, and relayed these details as a ghostly story. And to be fair, it looked as if she got pretty close. Some have suggested that maybe there was just a trace of personal malice in there, as Mary Jane made sure the ghost referenced Trout's alleged abusive behaviour during their brief marriage. We don't know for sure if there was any truth in this, as nobody else witnessed such behaviour. Maybe Mary Jane knew something that nobody else did, or maybe she was just speculating from allegations made during Trout's first marriage. Look, either way, Trout seems like a nasty piece of work, so whatever. But it's difficult to entirely trust a ghost's perspective on this one. And of course, Mary Jane is unlikely to have known the exact events that led up to the murder and what exactly prompted Trout to kill his wife. The story about bread and butter, applesauce, and raspberry jelly was very probably just a load of old tripe, which at least has some meat in it. However, maybe there are two fictional ghosts who should be taking a small slice of credit for the ultimate conviction of Trout's shoe on that gravestone. The Greenbrier ghost that didn't visit Mary Jane, and Fisher's ghost who wasn't seen by John Farley but very likely helped to inspire Mary Jane over 70 years later. Whilst neither of them really provided any testimony that could be taken seriously, they did help to pave the way for the gathering of circumstantial evidence which was destined to put Erasmus Trout's shoe behind bars for the rest of his life. Oh right, they didn't kill him, did they? They sentenced him to life in prison. Not that this turned out to be very long. He died of natural causes less than 3 years later after an epidemic of measles and pneumonia ripped through West Virginia Penitentiary in 1900. The past, everybody. Yeah, just healthy, regular dude in prison. And it's just like, oh no, what going? Measles. Get vaccinated, you idiots. At least we think he died of natural causes. At the time of writing, he hasn't yet come back from the dead to tell us what really happened, and that is the end of today's episode. I think I need to go and have a lie down, so we're going to end the episode there. Thank you for being here.